The Ontological Argument, Anselm of Canterbury. The Ontological Argument is one of the earliest proofs for God's existence. Anselm was a Benedictine monk who eventually became the Archbishop of Canterbury, and this was the time before the Protestant Reformation. So going back to around 1078, Anselm was a monk who was attempting at the time to integrate reason with faith. So the ontological argument is actually an attempt at proving what faith already told Anselm was true, namely that God exists. So at the time Anselm was writing, there's a sort of resurgence in interest in Greek philosophy, in particular the writings of Plato. Some of Aristotle was also coming to light. And what the church found, and what many in the church, like Anselm, were attempting to do, was to integrate this new knowledge into the faith. Because there's now a challenge, right? As opposed to relying on faith, what people found was that there were these reasoned arguments for various things, whether it's morality or metaphysics or even God. And Anselm wanted to find a sort of rational basis for God, that not only could we know God through faith on his account, but we could also know God through reason. And so what you see in Anselm's argument is an attempt to reconcile these two things. Now, it should be clear from the beginning that Anselm never doesn't believe in God, right? There's never a doubt in his mind that God exists. From the start, Anselm is sure that there is a God, that God exists. What he wants to do is sort of give that rational argument. How can I prove it to the fool? So he's basing that on the psalm. The fool has said in his heart that there is no God. So the fool is the one who denies the existence of God. So when we say fool, we think of it more in terms of someone who's silly or not smart or something along those lines. What Anselm is talking about is a reference to the Psalms where it's about the person who simply doesn't believe in the existence of God. And how could one be so foolish not to believe that? So what Anselm's trying to do is then address those individuals. Now, how many of those he actually thinks exist at this time, or whether he's actually taking it serious, that is a separate issue. But we do know that what he was attempting to do is say, look, even the fool is going to agree with this, that even if you don't believe in God, even if you deny the existence of God, once I give you this argument, I'm going to be able to prove to you that God does in fact exist. And this is the argument that's going to do it. So I want to start with a few preliminaries. And I think it's important to understand the context in which Anselm's argument is taking place, right? The assumptions that he's making from the beginning, or at least the general ideas that would have been prevalent in his age. So when Anselm talks about the proof for God's existence, he's thinking of a Judeo-Christian Muslim conception of God. So for Anselm, God is a creator God who made the world. So this is, again, standard sort of Judeo-Christian Muslim sort of thinking. God takes a personal interest in the world, particularly its human inhabitants. So for Anselm, this is a personal God. God is very powerful, perhaps omnipotent, all-powerful. God is omniscient, all-knowing. God is not infinite. There are beings that are at least distinct from God. So God is somehow separate from us, as a special kind of being, right? We are contingent beings. We're beings that could have not existed. For Anselm, God isn't that kind of being. God is a necessary being that has always existed, right? So if you look at Anselm's beliefs, God can't have a beginning, because that would imply something that comes before God, right? So God has to be the start of everything. So this really does go back to this sort of idea of an ultimate that we find in early Greek philosophy. Plato had this idea that there was a sort of standard, the form of goodness, and all good things share in this greater good, this ultimate goodness. Anselm had a similar notion of God, right? That there's this being that is so great, that is so powerful, that is all-knowing, that things that are great, that are good, share in this being. They share a part of that being. So God would have to be some sort of special, unique being. So Anselm doesn't think that his argument, as we'll see in a moment, doesn't think that his argument actually applies to every being. His argument only applies to this unique being, God, that's the ultimate source of everything good and powerful and wise and so forth. Anselm, although perhaps not explicitly, Anselm believes God has emotions, This is a standard sort of conception that God, there can be an angry God, there can be a vengeful God, there can be a loving God, right? So this God can exhibit various emotions, and that God does and can change, right? So we look at the God from the Old Testament to the New Testament. There's differences in the way God interacts with his creation. But Anselm does, as part of his argument, believe in this sort of standard Judeo-Christian conception of God. Although not every one of these would necessarily apply to him. But when we're thinking about this argument, we don't want to think about it in terms of, say, scientific reasoning, right? We don't want to think of this as, is he proving the existence of a God, just any God? No, he's proving the existence of a Judeo-Christian God that shares many of these features. So perhaps Anselm himself wouldn't agree that God changes, at least not fundamentally, or that he displays emotions. And I say he in this case because Anselm, of course, would have had God the Father as the conception that he's talking about. So maybe some of these Anselm would disagree with, but generally he's within this very well-known Judeo-Christian Muslim conception of a divine being. Now, the argument that Anselm gives for the existence of God is what we would term an a priori argument. Now, an a priori argument is one which proceeds from theoretical deduction rather than observation or experience, right? So a priori arguments do not, right? They do not rely on experience. So if I give you the following, if I said a bachelor is an unmarried man, you don't actually have to see a bachelor. You don't have to go out and observe bachelors to realize that they're unmarried and say, oh, that's a bachelor. You ask them, are they married? They say, yes, I'm not married. Oh, okay. And then you go to another bachelor and say, oh, there's another bachelor. Are you married? No. The idea, the very concept of bachelor contains within it the notion of being unmarried. So I don't actually have to rely on experience. So a priori knowledge comes from, reason alone. So without reference to experience, and it comes from just reason alone will give me the knowledge that I'm looking for. So bachelor is just one of those examples. There are other examples. Most of these are sort of tautologies, right, where the thing itself is an equivalence. So we'll find in Anselm's argument that there's no reference to observation or experience or reasons of cause and effect, which we'll see later when we look at Aquinas. So for Anselm, knowledge of God's existence is something that we can come to just by thinking about the very concept of God, right? So reason alone or looking at the concept of God will tell us or prove his existence. Now, as I mentioned before, for Anselm, God is a unique being, is a unique reality. And God is, for Anselm, he says, if I'm going to define what God is in a very general way, God is something that which a greater cannot be thought. So for Anselm, when we think of a divine being, when we think of God, what is it that God is? Well, God is the greatest thing that we can think of. And the greatest thing we can think of means that there's nothing else greater. So something than which a greater cannot be thought is what God is. Because obviously, if I could think of something greater, then that thing would be God, right? So if I thought of a being that was all-knowing and all good and all beautiful and whatever, and they say, wait a minute, but I can think of a greater being, right? One that's also all-powerful. So there can be an all-knowing God, but if it's not an all-powerful God, then that's not the greatest that I can think of. But once I come to that, once I realize that God is defined as something than which a greater cannot be thought, then I've terminated. That is what God is. Now, what he's then going to say is, if that was it, if I only had the thought of God, so if I have this conception of this perfect being, that something than which a greater cannot be thought, and it only existed in my mind, then that wouldn't be the greatest thing, right? If it only existed in intellectu, that's in the mind, in reason, that's not as great as something that exists in re. And re is just in reality. So if I have this concept of this perfect, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being, and it only existed in my head, then clearly that's not the greatest thing, because it would be greater if it actually existed in reality. And so for Anselm, just reflecting on the very idea of God, the very idea of God is something than which a greater cannot be thought. If that thought was all it was just a thought, then that wouldn't be as great as something that exists in re. And so for Anselm, existence is a perfection, and God is a perfect being. So remember, Anselm starts with the assumption that there is a God. All he wants to do is give an argument, a rational argument, to prove that, right? So his faith, his intuition tells him there's already a God, but he's looking for a reason. He says, just reflect on that concept. Just think about it. What does it mean to say that there's a God? To have a concept of God, that something than which a greater cannot be thought. And he's going to say, well, if that's all it is, it's not enough. It would have to exist. So the argument, though, only applies to beings like God. So as we'll talk about with some of the objections, Anselm doesn't think that this argument works for any being. It's got to be a being which terminates in something than which a greater cannot be thought. So if we look at Anselm's argument, we can sort of formalize his argument. Here's what it looks like. Anselm says, God is that being than which no greater can be conceived. Okay, so that's the definition of God. God exists as an idea in the mind. So Anselm says even the fool is going to have to admit that they have an idea of God, right? You say the word God, it has some meaning for the individual. What is that meaning? It's the greatest being, right? This is the most powerful being, that being that which no greater can be conceived. Premise 3 then says a being that exists in the mind and in reality is greater than one that exists only in the mind. And I think this is true of many things. So, okay, 3, we're not going to argue with that, because if I told you I've got this fantastic car and it gets great gas mileage and it goes extremely fast and it's comfortable and it's all this, and he said, that is a great car. And he said, oh, only if it existed, wouldn't it be great? And you go, wait a minute, that's not the greatest car. The greatest car would be all of those things, and it actually existed in reality. Well, something similar is being said here about God. If I have all these concepts of this great being, that can't be the greatest being I have in my head, right? That can't be what I'm conceiving. So premise 4 then says this, thus, if God exists only in the mind, then we can conceive of an even greater being, namely one that exists in both the mind and reality. So we can see that, of course, God existing in the mind wouldn't be the greatest. It would be one that exists in the mind and reality. But we cannot imagine something greater than God, going back to premise 1. Therefore, God must indeed exist in reality. So for Anselm, right, once we have this concept of God and we truly understand what that concept means, then the only thing that we can conceive of is a God that not only exists in the mind, but also exists in reality. Right? So premise 4 here, which we should say, thus, if God exists only in mind, then we can conceive of an even greater being, namely one that exists in both the mind and reality. So Anselm gives us this fairly compelling argument. Now, maybe it's compelling, maybe it's not. I'll leave that up to you to decide. But it's clear that if we agree that I have a conception, that than which no greater can be conceived is something that I conceive, right? So let me go back again and say that again. That than which no greater can be conceived, I do actually have a conception of that kind of being. Then that kind of being necessarily entails existence. It would have to have existence as part of it. And so, therefore, God must exist in reality. Now, this argument, of course, isn't without its critics. And in fact, it has at times held sway with individuals philosophically or people at large. And other times it's just been ridiculed as just a very poor argument. So we're going to start by going over the sort of famous objections of Guanillo to this argument, which was another monk of Anselm's time. So Guanillo's response to Anselm's argument is probably the most famous. And there are a number of them, and I realize in the readings, it's not always clear what exactly Guanillo is responding or how he's objecting. So some of it can get into very specific notions of words and word usage and the difference between thinking and conceiving and so forth. But Guanillo's most famous arguments deal with this idea of that than which no greater can be conceived. So this is where we're going to focus on just the idea, the sort of idea of holding in your head this concept of this type of being. Now, Guarnillo's first response to Anselm goes as follows. He says, there's a difference in having an object in mind, taken as preceding in time, and understanding that the object actually exists, taken as following in time. So what he wants to say is that Anselm's argument seems to imply that once I have this concept in my head, that somehow automatically what follows is that God exists, right? So having this is inherently or determines that something follows, that God is actually there in reality. And so what Guarnillo argues is, no, it's actually possible to have a concept and to think about this concept, to have an idea, without it at all translating into actual existence. So take the following example. When we have a painter, before a painting becomes a reality, it exists in the mind. So for Guarnillo, he's saying, look, I can have a concept of God, and this concept can have all these features that I attribute to it. So looking at this example here, you have Da Vinci conceiving of the Mona Lisa. He's thinking about the picture. He's thinking about the color. He's thinking about the facial structure and so forth. But none of that entails that it's the same thing as the actual painting, right? There can be a preceding thought about something which doesn't entail that the thing exists in reality. And what Guarnillo sees is that Anselm says that no, these two things would have to be together, that one necessarily entails the other. But it is possible, says Guarnillo, for someone to have this conception. So Guarnillo thinks the fool can actually have an idea of God. In other words, understand what we mean by than which no greater can be conceived, and have some sense of what that would mean without it in any way entailing that the picture in this case actually exists, or that God actually exists, right? So there's a difference between these two. Now, Guarnillo's second response is that even if that's possible, so if I grant you, Anselm, that it's possible to actually have a concept of that than which no greater can be conceived, then we run into those problems of the idea and reality. But he also says, what if I don't grant you that? So is it really possible to think or to conceive of that than which no greater can be conceived? So he says that we cannot think of that than which no greater can be conceived to exist. It is not similar to anything in existence. So Guarnillo is pointing out sort of what we call an Augustinian notion of language, right? When I use words refer to objects. And if I don't have an object to refer to, then I don't actually have a word or an idea, right? So the idea is in our head. When I say tree, it's not that you have any innate notion of what a tree is until you see a tree. And you don't know what treeness is. So if I point to a tree you've never seen before, you understand what that tree is because you've seen several examples of trees. And you say, well, it's got bark, it's got branches, it's got leaves on that tree. So it's that kind of, it's like other trees that I've seen before. But Guarnillo argues, it's possible, in fact, that we don't really have an idea of that than which no greater can be conceived. So let me give you another example. So let's look at the idea of a person, imaginary person, man, and then think about the idea of an image of God, or to a God image. So if you look at the sort of little cartoon here, if I say, think of a man, you might think, okay, light brown skin, long dark brown hair, goatee, and that kind of describes this person. So you've seen these sorts of things before, right? You've seen people with different skin color. You've seen people with different hair color. You've seen men with different facial hair. And so if I actually said, imagine some person or some woman, you could easily come up with an image of that person. But note that that image would be based on things that you've experienced before. You'd have an actual conception. You'd be thinking in sort of concrete terms, even if it's an abstraction, even if what you're putting together are bits and pieces from other individuals, you'd still have a concept of the person. Now I say to you, think of that than which no greater can be conceived. Well, on Guarnillo's account, I don't even know what that means. That than which no greater can be conceived. I can conceive of some things, and I can conceive of them being greater. So if I think of size, right, I can think of something being small and getting larger and larger and larger. But can I actually conceive of something so large it can't be thought any larger? Or can I think of something that's good that can't be thought any better or gooder. I don't think that actually works, but something that's ultimate good. Well, there seems to be a problem because am I really thinking of anything when I say that? I mean, so if we really think about it, when I'm asked that than which no greater can be conceived, what is it you're actually thinking about? Is it a person? But it seems that person doesn't quite capture it because I can always think of someone who's stronger or smarter. So what would that concept even look like? So one of the arguments Guinillo makes is that maybe we don't actually have a really good conception of that than which no greater can be conceived. We sort of understand the words, and we kind of understand conceptually what he's saying, but do we really have that idea? And if we don't really have that idea, then clearly the existence of that thing is drawn into question, right? If that's supposed to be what gives it its perfection, right? That there's this great thing, it's perfect. There's one thing that would make it more perfect exist in reality. Well, okay, I can have all that, but am I really thinking about anything, right? Is there any real thing that I'm actually focusing my thought on? Now, notice that's different when I think of the imaginary man in this example, right? So if I asked you to think of someone with brown hair and a goatee and darker skin or light brown skin and so forth, you would probably be able to come up with an image of someone. And that's because you've had that experience. But notice that same can't be said when we're thinking of the concept of God. So Guinillo's real point here is maybe, Anselm, I'm not going to grant you that we have this conception, that the fool, in fact, can understand what it is you're saying. And so if that's the case, then it's clear we're not basing our argument for God on reason, on a concept. And it's not by identifying the concept, we're really basing it on something else, right? Faith or intuition or something else. Now, the last response we're going to look at is the response of the existence in mind does not entail existence in reality, right? And this is Guinillo's probably his most famous point. It's the perfect island argument that he makes. So the argument essentially starts with this idea that just because I can think of something doesn't mean that that thing has to have any existence. So it's in some ways similar to the painter example, that we make a distinction between things in the mind, things in reality. But it's slightly different in that Guinillo argues that if we buy into Anselm's argument, then it seems that we can will anything into existence just by sort of positing its perfect version. So the perfect island argument. The perfect island argument goes something like this. Imagine, Guinillo says, that I have this concept of a perfect island. And this island is perfect in every way. It's perfect in, say, resources. And it has no people. Say, so it's uninhabited, right? There's no people here, so it's perfect. I can just go in without having any problem worrying about taking over, and it's got all the resources I need, and it's got the perfect climate. And that perfect climate can be anything. Say the island actually has every climate, right? So it's got tropical areas, and it's got desert areas, and it's got snow-capped areas, and it's got temperate areas, and you're just like, this is just perfect. No matter what I want, this island has. I imagine this island, and it's an island with clear blue water and all the food and everything that I would need. And we could even go even greater. Well, what would be greater? Well, it would have buildings already there for me, and they'd be perfect buildings, and they'd be the most comfortable buildings, and all of these things. And I keep going and going and going. And Guinillo says, look, I now have in my mind this concept of the perfect island, that than which no greater island can be conceived, and therefore that island must exist. Now, this argument in some ways seems compelling, because if you buy into that than which no greater can be thought to conceive, then you would have to buy into this sort of argument. But clearly experience tells us, right, that this doesn't work, right? Just because I have a concept of that doesn't mean that thing exists. Now, to give a response, Anselm will argue, and as I've already sort of noted, Anselm thinks that God is a special being. Right, so we're not talking about any being, we're talking about God. So the thinking about the concept of a perfect island is different than thinking about the perfect God. The other thing we might note is that in any perfect island, I can always think of a slightly more perfect island, right? So if there's 1,000 trees on the island, I could have 1,001 trees. And I could have, if I have an abundance of resources, I can think of even more resources. Right? And so whatever it is I have in an island on a physical contingent thing, so note the difference between a necessary and a contingent thing. A necessary being is God. Necessary means that God could not but have existed, right? It's necessary that God exists. God can't have a beginning because then God would be like us, a contingent, right? Our existence is something that didn't have to happen. We're the result of luck. Our parents got together, they had us. But it's possible that we could have never existed, whereas God is not that kind of being, right? It's a necessary being. Perfect islands or whatever other thing that you can imagine, those are contingent things. They don't have to exist in the way that God does. Now, another way to respond to this is to say that Anselm's argument is actually a little bit different than that. That what Anselm is saying is not just that than which no greater can be conceived. He's saying something like this: that than which a greater can be thought can be thought. So this is slightly different. If we change Anselm's argument a little bit, and other interpretations of Anselm have him saying just that. That than which a greater cannot be thought is thought. So what Anselm says is, look, islands, I can keep thinking of more and more perfect islands. When I think of God, though, that than which a greater cannot be thought can be thought. I can actually have a concept of something that no greater can be conceived of. If that than which a greater cannot be thought can be thought, then it has to exist in reality by necessity. Therefore, that than which a greater cannot be thought exists in reality. That's the sort of revision of an Anselm's argument. So what he's saying is, that than which a greater cannot be thought is something I actually have a concept of. But this then goes back to the previous objection, right? Do I really have that idea? And if I don't really have that idea, then Gwendolen's perfect island argument and his previous argument actually makes sense, that I'm really not thinking of something that than which a greater cannot be thought because I really don't have that conception. If you grant that you can have that, then Anselm says, then that kind of thing, that than which a greater cannot be thought, can be thought, I can have a thought of this great being, then reality necessarily is entailed. But with an island or any other thing, Anselm would argue, no, you really don't have a thought where that than which a greater cannot be thought can be thought, right? So the idea being that even if I have an idea of a perfect island, I can always think of a more perfect island. And so Anselm says, see, there isn't really, you really haven't stopped. You can think of a greater and a greater and a greater. And because of that thing, whatever it is, you can always think of something being better, there being a better version of. That thing can't be something that necessarily exists in reality. The only thing this applies to for Anselm then is God. And so that's the ontological argument.